everybody. Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Chpt. And remember, if you enjoyed the episode, if you like what you hear, hit that like and subscribe button. Hit that notification bell so you get notified each time I make a new video. Today we're starting Chapter 3 of Defining Moments in Black History by Dick Gregory, entitled The More Things Change, the More They Stay the Same. The blurb at the beginning says, "To tell the truth, that's how a lot of race progress has been made in America. The country gets shamed into doing things it doesn't want to do." Let's dig in. Some folks say that history works in cycles. Things change all the time, but decades later you can look back to a certain point, and what you're looking at feels the same as what you're going through. Which is something I experienced many times during the last book. Tune in. In this chapter, I give one example of that involving George Wallace and Donald Trump. There's no denying that black folks have made a lot of progress in America over the centuries. Of course, some people will point to that progress and say, look, it's better than it was. And the unspoken message there is, stop your complaining. Brother Malcolm X had a response to that, a good response to that. You don't stick a knife into a man's back 9 inches, pull it out 6 inches and call it progress. But it does seem that for every advance black people make, something comes along to make us wonder if we're really going anywhere at all. And that can make you feel discouraged. Sometimes it seems we have to fight not to go forward. Sometimes it seems we have to fight not to go forward, but just to hold on to what we have. And you know something? That's exactly right. But if we keep fighting, maybe, just maybe, we can take care of that extra 3 inches and then start seeing about treating the wound. Plessy versus Ferguson. People are strange. And racists have got to be the strangest ones of all. You never saw a group of people say one thing and do another so much in your life. Sometimes racists don't seem so much evil as just plain crazy. Sometimes. Take segregation. Since the first black folks came to America, we've been every shade from the blackest black to almost pure white. You want me to tell you why? Here's one reason. Slave owners couldn't keep their hands off slave women to save their lives. They might not have said they were doing it, but the evidence was walking around for everybody to see. Everybody knew what was going on, or should have known. So when nobody was looking, white folks were all for integration. You couldn't get more integrated than that. But when it came to public spaces, they called for separation and segregation like a little baby hollering for his mama. Here's an example. In 1890, Louisiana passed the Separate Car Act. That meant blacks and whites had to ride in separate cars on railroads. A group of folks in New Orleans, blacks and whites, were against the act. The railroad company was against it too. Not necessarily because it loved black folks, but because it didn't want to spend the money to have extra train cars. So together, they came up with a plan. Here's something a lot of folks don't understand. Would you have got into a boxing ring against Muhammad Ali or Mike Tyson without spending 1 minute training? Hell no, you wouldn't. Not if you wanted to live to see another day. But folks think protesters just woke up one morning and say, think I'll go change the world today, and then go out and get themselves thrown in jail. They think Rosa Parks was just too tired to give up her seat. So she said, screw it, I'm staying right here. call Martin Luther King. No. Protesters plan the things they do. The group in New Orleans, the Citizens Committee, talked a mixed-race man named Homer Plessy into getting on a white train car in Louisiana. They even hired a detective to find Plessy on the train and arrest him. Now, the 14th Amendment, which had been passed in 1868 overturning the Dred Scott decision, said that black folks born in the United States were citizens. After Plessy was arrested, the Citizens Committee, as planned, sued the state of Louisiana, saying that arresting Plessy because of the Separate Car Act was a violation of the 14th Amendment. Never mind that it was the committee that got him arrested in the first place. Slick, right? That's called planning. That's the difference between a group of activists and a mob. It wasn't quite slick enough, though. 2 courts in Louisiana ruled against Plessy. Then the Citizens Committee took the case to the U.S. Supreme Court, which did the same thing. The Supreme Court said that just because blacks and whites had separate facilities, that didn't mean one was better than the other, and that decision made separate but equal the law of the land, whether everything was equal or not, which it most definitely was not. But here's the thing. The kind of planning that went into getting Plessy arrested and bringing a lawsuit is the same kind of planning that went into the civil rights movement in the next century. And this time it worked better. And almost 100 years after the Dred Scott decision, separate but equal got overturned with the decision in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. What does that tell you? That change is slow, but if you keep fighting, it does come. The Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen are like storybook heroes. With Hitler on the rise in Germany, the United States started thinking about how it could get ready in case things heated up over in Europe. Late in 1938, President Franklin Roosevelt announced that the government would pay to train pilots near some colleges and universities. That's how the civilian pilot training program got set up. At first, the military wasn't too excited about it. What good were civilians? Then Germany invaded Poland in 1939, which started World War II, and the military started thinking it might need some help after all. One of the schools where the training was taking place, matter of fact, the main one, was the all-black Tuskegee Institute. Pilots there started training in 1941. In December of that year, the Japanese attacked the U.S. military base at Pearl Harbor, and the United States was in the war for real. Tuskegee trained more than 900 pilots, and almost half of them saw combat. Now keep in mind, this was the 1940s, and for black folks it wasn't as simple as just learning to fly and then going over to fight. Jim Crow was an old man by then, but he was still alive and well. The Tuskegee Airmen were trained by white officers. Those black folks were learning how to fly, but the Air Force wouldn't give them bombs to practice with. So they took tin cans instead and dropped them by hand? No shit. Then they integrated the armed forces during World War II. In the Air Force, though, the black flyers could only be escort pilots. They had to guard the guys in the real Air Force. Then they noticed that out of all those white dudes who had black pilots guarding them, none of them got shot down. One of the Tuskegee Airmen, Wendell Pruitt, out of St. Louis, helped sink an enemy battleship with nothing but a machine gun fired from an airplane. Later, they messed up and named a big St. Louis housing project after him, and William L. Igoe, I-G-O-E, a congressman. What? Housing project after him and William L. Igoe, a congressman. And that place became a bloodbath. It seemed like more people got killed there than in Vietnam. Oh, you better be careful what you name things. So now the U.S. Armed Forces and their allies were getting ready for D-Day, the invasion of France to free Europe from the Nazis. This was the big thing. So they go to General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force strategist, and they say, we've got a problem. There's an Italian castle that we can't get by. They shoot everything down. So we have to either postpone D-Day or find another way in. And there's no other way. LeMay said, You came to the right man, excuse me. You came to the right man. I've got a group of boys who can drop a bomb through a window. He was talking about the Tuskegee Airmen. If those bombers hadn't blown up that castle, there wouldn't have been a D-Day. Before it was all over, black pilots had flown in 9 squadrons in World War II. Benjamin O. Davis, a black man, led the 332nd Fighter Group. They went on to 179 bomber escort missions and shot down more than 100 enemy aircraft. They helped beat Hitler, which means they helped save the whole world. Medgar Evers' murder. Medgar, there was nobody like him. He was almost in a separate category of human being. So kind, so humble, and so dedicated to the movement and to his people. He was born in 1925 in Mississippi and wasn't but 37 when he was murdered in 1963. But in his short life, he led the Mississippi NAACP, fought for voting rights and voter registration, and inspired a whole lot of folks. Being with him, I fell in love with the church movement in the South, the voting rights campaign down there, the whole thing. That movement got so strong, you know that didn't sit right with racists. So one night when I was down there, I said to Medgar, Man, I think something's going to happen. It doesn't feel right. White folks had strange looks on their faces. Before something could happen, though, Medgar called me. I was staying at a black minister's house and said, Man, you need to call home. Your wife just called. I said, I'll do that later. He said, No, it's important, man. I told him, I think the white folks are getting ready to throw a bomb or something, and I ain't leaving nowhere. Medgar knew that my son, Richard Jr., 2 months old, had just died, but he didn't want to tell me. He just wanted me to call home. He said, Greg, your son's sick. I said, so what? Greg, he's dead. I flew home to Chicago to be with my wife. She was in shock. Eventually I was too, but soon after I went back to Mississippi. Now here is how the universe works. My plane back to Mississippi got in late, and I had to perform in Chicago later, so I had to leave Medgar's house earlier than planned. Well, Byron de la Beckwith was waiting to kill us at Medgar's house. De la Beckwith was a member of the White Citizens Council, which had sprung up after the U.S. Supreme Court said in 1954 that school segregation was unconstitutional. The only reason I'm not dead is that my son died, and my flight back to Mississippi was delayed. That's heavy. Before I left Medgar that day, I hugged him and I said, Man, I'm sorry I don't get to die with you. I love you, man. He knew he was going to be killed. he even knew who was going to do it. De La Beckwith went free after 2 trials in 1964 when all-male, all-white juries failed to convict him. Now let me fast forward. How did De La Beckwith get money? Well, his daddy was a postmaster. Now President Kennedy, out of all the land to buy for a post office, bought his land for 50 grand. That's how De La Beckwith had the money to pay. Kennedy was one of these low-down dogs whom black folks don't know anything about but like, because they can't spot a racist when he's smiling and putting on a big show of loving black folks. They can't tell the difference between a good white person and a bad one. Why do I say Kennedy was a low-down dog? When they cut off food stamps in Mississippi in retaliation for voter registration drives, it had Kennedy's blessing. When that happened, I went back to Mississippi and said, I'll pick up the tab. I'll send 7 tons of food every 2 weeks. I'll pay for it. And the Kennedy boys, and I didn't know this until Kathy Hughes and TV One did a show called Unsung, and I don't know where she got the tapes. You can hear them saying, we've got to send food stamps again because that Dick Gregory is getting too much worldwide attention. I don't know whether to believe that or not. But let me fast forward again. Medgar's widow, Merle Evers Williams, pushed and pushed until she got a new trial for Medgar's murderer. They tried De La Beckwith again in 1994. This time he went to prison, where he died at age 80 in 2001. A lot of evil went down in Mississippi, but some good happened too, because of one man, Medgar Evers. Four little girls killed in the Birmingham church bombing of 1963. Carol Denise McNair was 11 years old when she died on September 15th, 1963. And Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley were but 14. All 4 of them were murdered. And if their murder wasn't the lowest act ever committed in this country, I don't want to think about what was. 4 so-called men from the Ku Klux Klan planted dynamite under the front steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Blew the girls' bodies apart. If somebody asks you what cowardly means, tell them that story. If the 4 Klan members had really been men, they would have at least attacked the grown black folks they had problems with. Then again, they've got a problem with all black folks, men, women, and children. That's why they're Ku Kluxers, not men. The Klan was very strategic. It wasn't just any black church they bombed. Black folks had done a lot of organizing there. James Bevel and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had put together the Children's Crusade there in May 1963. That was when more than 1,000 students went on march to challenge the mayor on integration. Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, and many other civil rights leaders met at that church to plan voter registration drives. The Klan members probably didn't plan it this way, but what they did helped a lot of people finally see what was happening to black folks, and that helped get civil rights laws passed. At one hell of a price. Over time, the bombing demonstrated something else. How much had changed in a few years. Right after the bombing took place, the FBI investigated it. But what's the point of sending one bunch of racists to catch another bunch? The local police in Birmingham had the names of the 4 from the Klan who they thought had done it, and they gave the names to the FBI, but the FBI director at that time was J. Edgar Hoover. And if black folks ever had a worse enemy than that son of a... I take it back. We never did. Hoover blocked the prosecution of the 4 Klan members and closed the FBI investigation, and that was it. Well, that seemed to be it, until 8 years later when a man named Bill Baxley became Attorney General of Alabama. He was just a law student at the time of the bombing, so there wasn't much he could do then, but as Attorney General, he reopened the church bombing case and got access to the original FBI files. That's when he found out that the FBI had evidence it didn't provide to the original prosecutors in Birmingham. It took 6 years to convict the first of the accused Klan members in 1977, and it took until 2000 to nail 2 more. The 4th one had died already. 2 of the others died in prison. You can do what you want in this life, but the universe will get around to you. Passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Well, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did one big thing. It put a law between us black folks and racist craziness. For example, if you were running a program that operated on money from the government, and you were even thinking about discriminating against black folks, the law said you don't get federal money if you can't prove you've done this, this, and this. That made a big, big difference. People might say I'm opening up my organization to all people out of the graciousness of my heart. And maybe they were. But mainly it was because they wouldn't get federal contracts if they didn't do it. The Civil Rights Act made it illegal to discriminate against anybody in public facilities. Made it so blacks and whites didn't have to use separate bathrooms, drink out of separate fountains. It set up the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to prevent discrimination in the workplace, and it gave the Attorney General the power to protect people from racism in everything from education to voting. So there's nothing you can compare the Civil Rights Act to. There's nothing you can compare to the Civil Rights Act. That's what happens when I read too fast, huh? 99% of blacks' current success came from that law. Except it didn't happen just like that. And a lot of what made it happen had to do with things going on down south. Martin Luther King Jr. called Birmingham the most segregated city in America. So he and others set out to desegregate it. He ran the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which led the fight to end segregation. The SCLC put together boycotts of businesses that wouldn't hire blacks and trained high school and college students to sit at segregated lunch counters. Let me tell you, those were some brave young men and women sitting there calmly while white folks did anything they wanted to them. But what really got folks' attention was the 1963 protest march from the 16th Street Baptist Church to Birmingham City Hall. Well, the head of the Birmingham Police Department, Eugene Bull Connor, didn't like that one bit. He had the police use fire hoses and attack dogs on those poor young people. And folks all over the country saw it on television. The world, too. Now, before that, in 1960, John F. Kennedy had been elected president. He came into office with promises to back civil rights, but he took his time getting around to it. When that mess happened in Birmingham, though, he saw that he had to do something, so he proposed the Civil Rights Act. There were 2 problems, though. One, it had to get through Congress. And when it comes to being discriminatory, the Congress we have today doesn't have a thing on the one back then. And 2, even if Congress passed the legislation, President Kennedy wasn't around to sign it. The same year as the Birmingham protests, Kennedy was assassinated. That made his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, president of the United States. Now, Johnson was a Southerner, but he was a Southerner who wanted to do something for black folks. Now, the problem was to get the bill past the racist congressmen from the southern states. When they brought the bill to the floor of Congress for debate, the Southerners filibustered, getting up and talking trash to run out the clock and kill the bill. But Democratic Senator Herbert Humphrey, who was backing the bill, figured out that he had enough votes for Congress to end the filibuster, and that's what they did. And Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law on July 2nd, 1964, with Martin Luther King Jr. standing right behind him. And I want to just add, he doesn't state it, but from what I've learned is that Lyndon Johnson, the Civil Rights Act was important to Lyndon Johnson because he was kind of doing it in honor of President Kennedy. He was like completing his mission. The Civil Rights Act brought a new day for black folks. But something else happened too. What they call a white backlash. Some white folks got resentful and even violent when the Civil Rights Act started getting enforced. And that backlash had a lot to do with the rise of desegregationist presidential candidate George Wallace. Which brings us back to the beginning when he said he was going to talk about Wallace and Trump, and I've got like 2 sentences left. Decades later, we had 8 years of a black president, and some folks resented that so much that the next thing we knew, the more things change, the more they stay the same. That wasn't really about President Trump or George Wallace. Passage of the Voting Rights Act, 1965. The Voting Rights Act, its 50-year anniversary was celebrated a couple of years ago. That means that if you were 30 years old when it passed, you're over 80 now. 50 years of voting for some folks. But voting rights, registering to vote, they don't mean a thing if you don't have voter education. Why do you think black folks go in and pull one lever all for Democrats? Because they think, that way I can't make a mistake. Nobody knows how to split a ticket because it's rarely explained. It's like being on an airplane when they give the emergency instructions. I always wonder, with all the time people spend at the airport, why the airlines don't have time to teach us how to use that mask then. That's a good point. The airlines spend 2 seconds on it when you're sitting on the plane when they could give you a complex tutorial while you're going through the TSA check. The only time I see the mask is when there's an emergency and I'm supposed to learn it then. They just tell us jump in the water. The life preserver's under the seat. It's the same with voter education. The government gives people the right to vote but doesn't show them their options. Amen. The Democrats couldn't believe that black folk just come out and voted for them every time. They didn't have to spend any money getting our votes. When the Democrats lost the Senate and the House in 2010, nobody should have been surprised. Why? Because black folks who should have known better didn't have the integrity to pressure Democrats to do anything. To say, look, we want $200 million going to publications on voter education. Meanwhile, if 50 years ago you were age 30 and you're 80 now, you've got trouble with your bladder, you've got trouble with your memory, yet they don't ask for money for buses with toilets in them and to take old folks to where they can vote. Plus, you know how many black folks, and probably white folks too, die because they forget they've already taken their medication? It's the same thing with voting. Some old white folks don't vote because they think they already have. there should be more voter education. But that doesn't mean the Voting Rights Act isn't important. In some places in the country, mostly the South, it's been the only thing letting some black folks vote at all. Congress passed the law and President Lyndon Johnson signed it on August 6th, 1965, but just like any area where black people have made progress, we didn't get it without fighting for it. A lot of ignorant people look at black folks and say, slavery's been over 150 years. What's the matter with y'all? What they don't think about is that all the obstacles that racists put in place so black folks wouldn't have much more freedom after slavery than we had under it. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution was supposed to protect our right to vote, but the people who didn't want black folks voting found some ways around that. At first, beginning in the 1860s, right after slavery ended, they used plain old violence to try to keep us away from the polls. Then in the decades after that, they started to get slick. It was, hey boy, welcome to the voting booth. Step right up. Sure, you can vote. Just a couple things we've got to get straight first. You own some property, don't you, boy? No? Well then, I'm mighty sorry, but... Or, yeah, gal, come on in. You can vote just as soon as you read this here document with all these fancy words I don't even understand myself and tell me exactly what it all means. Don't make no mistakes now. In 1903, in Giles versus Harris, the U.S. Supreme Court decided it didn't have the power to force states to register black folks. And that's how things stood for a good long time. Then came the 1950s and 1960s. Along with pushing for everything else, civil rights activists pushed for the federal government to protect black folks' right to vote. In 1965, in Marion, Alabama, activists were having a voting rights march at night, and police came and started busting heads. That night, a young black man, a protester named Jimmy Lee Jackson, got shot to death. And if you've been listening to the previous chapters, you already know who that is, right? Right? I hope so. Afterward, Martin Luther King Jr. and James Bevel from the SCLC and John Lewis and others from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, so many initials, organized the marches from Selma to Montgomery. Police on horseback were there to meet them, and maybe if I tell you that that day has been called Bloody Sunday ever since, you'll have an idea of what happened next. Folks all over the country saw that bloodbath on TV. Now, with the whole country outraged, black and white, the pressure was on President Johnson. He pushed the Voting Rights Act through Congress, and finally, black folks had some protections when it came to voting. The Voting Rights Act has different sections. Section 2 makes it so states can't pass any law that results in racial discrimination. Yet they do anyway. Section 5 makes it so nobody can make any changes that affect voting without first going through the U.S. Attorney General or the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. And Section 4B protected black voters against the southern states that were their worst enemies in the 1960s. Notice for that last one I said protected, not protects. That's because the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 2013, 6 years ago, well, 6 years ago if you're watching this year, in Shelby County versus Holder, that we didn't need Section 4B anymore because, and I quote, Things today aren't like they were in the 1960s. End quote. Section 5 is still in place, but Section 5 without Section 4B is like a car without wheels. It's still a car, but it can't do the main thing you need it to do. Whatever is won, we've got to protect.